I carried my husband's phone into the repair shop on Commercial Street, thinking I was doing what any wife does on a busy Tuesday, ticking off a small chore that didn't deserve a second thought. And yet the moment our longtime family friend Kevin Torres drew me aside with that grave look and turned the glowing screen toward me, the ordinary scaffolding of my life buckled, because what I saw was not a cracked display begging for a new pane of glass, but a lined-up future in cold little squares, a queue of pre-scheduled text messages ready to fly out into the world without him lifting a finger. I've always believed it's the small, automatic choices that decide our fate more than the proud, dramatic ones. And that morning in Portland, Maine, I had simply lifted Robert's phone from his nightstand, recognized the spiderweb fracture he'd ignored for weeks, and decided to help, never imagining that a simple errand could slice a quiet marriage cleanly in two. My name is Stella Hammond, 66, 41 years married to the same man in an old Victorian on Munjoy Hill, where our 3 children learned to take the stairs carefully, and where, in later years, grandchildren tracked in December, snow and July sand, as if the house itself breathed with the seasons. And after nearly 4 decades as a librarian, I had retired into a life that felt calm and predictable in the blessedly boring way of weather you can read without checking the forecast, while Robert still put in part-time hours as a dentist and talked endlessly about stopping, although the restlessness that had kept him pacing and checking his phone the night before suggested an altogether different countdown. Our roles had been clear for decades, as neat as labeled drawers in a card catalog, with him owning the finances and the big decisions, and me keeping the home steady and the peace intact. And I had learned to stop pushing when he smoothed his voice into that professional calm that made patients trust him and made me, over time, quiet. Kevin's shop sat between a cafe and a used bookstore, and survived because neighbors trusted it the way you trust a light on your porch, to be there every evening, and for 15 years he had fixed our gadgets, and, in small ways, our nerves. His wife once brought me soup when pneumonia settled in my chest. His daughter used to come to my book club, so when he called at 3:30 with an unusual urgency and asked me to come alone, I felt that subtle tilt in the day that older women recognize, the sense that life is about to be measured in a before and an after. He closed the door and flipped the sign and spoke my first name in a careful way he'd never used, then told me to freeze the cards and change the locks. And when I demanded to know why, he showed me the proof. 7 future-dated texts to one number, spaced across 3 months. Not a single word about love, only instructions, insurance policy numbers, safe combinations, and repeated mentions of my supposed memory problems that he had allegedly reported to Dr. Patterson. An orderly plan to rationalize my death and collect a $750,000 payout, culminating in a final message scheduled for January 12th that said it was done. The funeral had been yesterday, Boca next week, the condo ready, as if my absence were a logistical milestone and not a life. Kevin, pale with horror, urged me to call the police, but I understood how quickly a respected dentist could talk his way around drafts and hypotheticals, while a retired librarian could be framed as forgetful. So I asked him to document everything, every screen and timestamp, then to hand the phone back tomorrow with a smile and the lie that nothing at all had been unusual, because sometimes the only way to expose a trap is to step away and let the trapper believe you never saw it. I drove home through that late October gold that makes the bay look like hammered metal pretending to be water, and I cooked wild salmon the way I always do, my hands moving through a memorized ritual while my mind mapped a new terrain. And when Robert came in at 6:15 and kissed my cheek and talked about the dental office and our son's Thanksgiving plans and the Red Sox as if conversation were a metronome he could keep perfectly, I listened for the crack that didn't come, heard instead the practiced beat of a story he had already seeded, even when he slid in remarks about one last big Christmas in the old house and the need to downsize because I might be slipping, which I answered with a soft insistence that my memory was fine, because I had no intention of announcing that I finally understood I was living with a man who considered me an obstacle with a date on it. Later, while he settled into his study, I washed the dishes and climbed the stairs to a bedroom that suddenly felt staged, sat at my desk, and opened his email. And because he had never needed to hide from me, he had never changed his passwords, which is how I found, after steady hours of searching, a tucked-away folder labeled with the kind of dull phrase men choose when they think women will not look too closely, and inside it the trail to a woman named L. Hardy, early notes on valuing his dental practice, later phrases about a clean break from your current situation, and a condo in Boca Raton closing in January, the very month my funeral text pretended would already be behind us, and the numbers showed a practice worth nearly $2 million, not the modest figure I'd been told, so I took screenshots and sent them to a private account and cleaned my tracks and lay down beside a husband who slept soundly with his arm across my pillow, a familiar weight that now felt like an artifact from a museum of a life I thought I understood. At dawn, I walked to the only place where my breath slows and my reason sharpens, the Portland Public Library, a second home for nearly 4 decades, and asked Marion at the reference desk for discreet help, which is a phrase librarians understand better than any other, and together we followed the thread from L to Laura Hardy, 42, Boston consultant specializing in medical practice acquisitions, divorced, successful, often in Portland for work, and as the search results settled into a name and a biography and a travel pattern, the line connecting a condo in Boca and a January calendar, and my supposed forgetfulness became hard and straight and undeniable. In that quiet sanctuary of stacks and sunlight, I realized that the woman I had been for years, the one who balanced the checkbook of peace and kept the holiday china wrapped just so, would have waited and hoped. But the woman the messages created in me understood that hope is not a plan, and that the safest place to keep the truth is inside a carefully built file, a calm face, and a clock that suddenly, blessedly, is mine to set. By the time Marion and I were done, there was no room left for denial. Every thread pointed to the same truth. Laura Hardy, Robert's L, was real. The condo was real, and the clock toward January 12th was already ticking. Marion found her on LinkedIn, the kind of polished profile that gleamed with curated success. 42, freshly relocated to Portland to manage a major acquisition. A quick check of property records confirmed a cash purchase 6 months ago, an $800,000 Harbor View condo on Pearl Street. The money trail ran straight from Robert's practice account. By noon, we'd reconstructed enough to redraw the map of my marriage. Laura's finances were a wreck, collapsed business, unpaid loans, and a string of angry creditors, and the Portland condo had been bought through a shell company funded by Robert's dental office. Either she was embezzling from him, or he was bankrolling her future. Then Marion found the elder fraud complaint in Massachusetts, a patient who'd accused Laura of coercing him into signing over assets. Case dismissed for lack of proof. "She has a pattern," Marion whispered, and I finally saw it. Robert wasn't the predator. He was the prey who thought he was hunting. He believed he was plotting my death, but Laura Hardy was already plotting his. My phone buzzed then. Robert's voice tight, calculated calm over a thread of anger. He wanted me home immediately. Dr. Patterson was there, he said, making a house call to review my supposed cognitive screening. There had never been any screening. I understood at once. Robert was fabricating medical records in real time, building the case for my mental decline. If I refused, it would look like paranoia. If I went, I could prove my sanity on record. I told Marion I'd take the test and pass it. At home, the stage was set, complete with folder labeled Cognitive Assessment, Stella Hammond. Patterson looked uneasy, Robert confident. The test began, designed to trip me up with subtle misdirections, but 41 years with Robert had trained me to read the pauses behind the words. I answered every question with precision, turned their trap inside out, and when it ended, Patterson admitted my cognition was flawless. That was when I tore apart the forgery. Wrong suite number, wrong letterhead, wrong date, and forced the doctor to realize he was holding evidence of a crime. He fled, leaving Robert and me alone in a silence that felt like a locked room filling with gas. Robert tried to rewrite the scene as concern for his confused wife. But when he grabbed my wrist and demanded to know how much I'd uncovered, the mask slipped. I told him everything: the Boca condo, the $800,000 transfer, the woman with a history of elder fraud, and watched his eyes shift from fear to calculation. He admitted the affair, framed it as a midlife resurrection, claimed the texts were fantasy, and when I refused to accept that lie, he turned to power. He reminded me he was executor of the will, that Patterson's forged notes made him my legal guardian in waiting, that with one call he could have me placed on psychiatric hold for 72 hours, and when I came out, I'd have the record to prove I was unstable. He was right. The system would take his side. I'd confronted him too soon. Just then, Marion's text flashed. Urgent discovery. Come now, don't call. I bluffed my way out of the house, met her at the library, and the headlines she showed me iced my blood. 3 dead men, 3 accidents. Each had been wealthy, older, partnered with Laura Hardy. 1 overdose, 1 carbon monoxide accident, 1 suicide. Each time Laura walked away rich and untouched. She was the common denominator, the pattern repeating, and my husband was next in line. I should have wanted her to finish him first, but the thought of our children, Michael, Michelle, Jennifer, snapped the anger back into purpose. If Robert died without the truth on record, our family would drown in scandal and doubt. I had to prove everything. I had to talk to her. Her building on Pearl Street gleamed with that kind of curated luxury that's meant to impress auditors and ghosts alike. I rang once, twice, and when her voice finally came through the speaker, smooth, unhurried, utterly composed, I introduced myself. Stella Hammond. There was a pause, then an invitation. 4th floor. The elevator hummed like a countdown. Laura opened the door before I could knock. She was striking, yes, but more than that. Sharp, deliberate, the kind of woman who studied people for leverage. She greeted me by name and claimed she'd been expecting me. The condo was minimalist, expensive, the harbor view impossible to ignore. She offered wine. I declined. She mentioned Robert's concern that I was becoming paranoid. When I refused to play along, she dropped the pretense. Calmly, elegantly, she laid out the blueprint of destruction. Robert's plot to kill me, his plan to stage my death, and then her own plan to erase him once his usefulness ended. She described it all with the serenity of someone reciting weather data, the murder-suicide staged for pity, the liquidation of assets she would oversee for a consulting fee. Then she smiled and presented her bargain. Help her expose Robert, testify against him, survive, and split the proceeds of the practice, $1 million each, a devil's partnership. She promised safety, wealth, vindication. And as I looked at her, a woman tied to 3 corpses offering me life at half price, I realized that whatever I said next would decide who lived to see January 12th and who didn't. By the time Laura finished speaking, the cafe's warmth felt counterfeit, a soft glow wrapped around a blade. She looked at me across the small table, calm and certain, like a woman who had already written the ending of my story. Her voice was low and confident, every word sliding into place with practiced precision. Or you can try to stop him alone and end up another tragic statistic, she'd said. Another elderly woman with dementia who overdosed on her medication. How do you think he's planning it, Stella? Pills? A fall? Carbon monoxide while you sleep? Then my phone buzzed. Robert's message glowing on the screen. Where are you? We need to talk. Come home. Laura watched the color drain from my face and smiled, knowing exactly what the message meant. He's getting impatient, she murmured. He's making his move. So what's it going to be, Stella? Partner with me in survival, or go home to your husband and take your chances? 8 hours until midnight. 8 hours to choose between a killer's bargain and a murderer's embrace. I stepped into the cold October rain, Robert's pleading texts lighting up my phone. "Stella, please, come home. I'm worried about you." The streets blurred into slick reflections, and for the first time, I felt the gravity of being hunted from 2 directions at once. Robert wanted me dead for freedom and money. Laura wanted him dead for profit and cover, and both of them thought I was harmless. I drove to the Eastern Promenade, parked near the overlook where the bay spread like black glass beneath the storm clouds, and tried to think. The air tasted of salt and iron. My thoughts were sharp, but cold, mechanical. I wasn't prey anymore. I was inventorying predators. Robert had already started poisoning my reputation, calling our children, twisting my reality into his narrative of decline. When my eldest, Michael, called, the concern in his voice wasn't love, it was doubt planted by his father. He told me Robert said I was paranoid, that I'd been fabricating stories about fake records and mysterious women. And when he mentioned a facility, a place for evaluation, I understood what came next. If Robert couldn't kill me quietly, he'd lock me away alive and let the system do it for him. I needed to shatter that illusion before it hardened. So I asked him the one question that would anchor him in truth. Where was I on September 12th? He hesitated, confused, and when I explained that Robert had forged medical records, claiming I'd been at Dr. Patterson's office while I was actually at a library conference in Boston, with receipts, photos, and witnesses, silence replaced his certainty. "Someone's making me look incompetent, Michael," I said, "and your father's the one doing it." He promised to come, bringing Michelle and Jennifer with him, and I could only hope he'd arrive before the final act began. 3 hours to midnight. Rain gone, air raw. I called Marion. Together we built a dossier thick enough to fill a courtroom. Every email, every transfer, every forged document, dated, cross-referenced, labeled, a record of methodical betrayal. But as we stared at the stack under the library's fluorescent light, I knew it wasn't enough. Every piece of paper could be dismissed, reframed, rationalized. I didn't need evidence that could be argued. I needed proof that couldn't. The kind of proof that captured its own confession. So I set the trap. At 9 o'clock, I called Laura. Told her I'd join her plan, that I wanted survival over martyrdom. We arranged to meet at a public cafe on Congress Street. Neutral ground, open space, witnesses. I wasn't alone. Marion watched from another table, laptop open, her phone recording audio and video. Laura arrived on time, poised as ever, cappuccino in hand, sliding into the booth with that easy composure of a woman who's never been cornered. She carried a folder, its edges neat and deliberate. "So you've decided to be smart," she said. "I've decided to stay alive," I replied. She laughed softly. "That's not the same thing." Then she pushed the folder toward me. Inside were copies of Robert's messages, the bank transfers, even the forged medical records. Too perfect, too clean, as if assembled for an exhibit. "This is everything the police will need," she said. "We go together tomorrow morning. You and me, and 2 credible women with matching stories. They'll arrest Robert immediately." It was bait, I realized. Bait wrapped in logic. She needed me to look complicit so she could control the narrative once Robert was gone. "After he's arrested," I asked, "what happens?" She smiled. "You hire me to handle the sale. I get my fee. You get the rest. We both walk away clean." When I mentioned the 3 men she'd left dead behind her, she didn't flinch. "I didn't kill anyone, Stella. People die. Accidents happen. And if you try to connect me, you'll look unhinged. Investigative wives always do." Then her phone buzzed, a quick glance, a tightening at the eyes. "Robert," she said. "He's getting nervous. He wants me to come to your house. Says he needs help with something." She paused, meeting my gaze with surgical precision. "He's planning to do it tonight, Stella. He wants me there to help stage it. Make it look like an accident." Outside, the city moved on, oblivious. headlights sliding across wet pavement while the clock toward midnight kept ticking. I realized then that the storm wasn't passing. It was gathering, inside my house between two killers, waiting for me to come home. I told her we should call the police now, and she stood with that cool certainty and said there was nothing to report yet except a husband texting his business partner. So the plan remained to walk in together at 9 a.m. with evidence neatly arranged while I found a safe bed for the night. And as she disappeared into the October dark, I felt Marion at my elbow and slipped the library's tiny digital recorder back into my purse, knowing we had every word, the admission that she was working with Robert and the confirmation that my death was penciled in for tonight, not as a confession that would win a headline, but as a beginning, a lever under the whole rotten mechanism. I told Marion I was going home because the only way to stop a moving train is to stand on the track with the camera rolling, and I left her with the instructions no one ever wants to give a friend, that if I didn't call by midnight, she was to take the folder and the audio to the police and say my name like a bell. The house waited the way a stage waits, a single kitchen light, a bottle breathing on the table, 2 glasses already poured like a script had been placed and underlined, and Robert smiled with that familiar warmth that had covered sins I never imagined, inviting me to sit and talk and resolve things, and I stayed standing because I had come to end the play, not join it. I asked where Laura was and watched the flinch he couldn't hide. Told him she wasn't coming because she'd finished with him and because he was alone now with a wife who knew the story and a plan that had sprung leaks. And when he asked how much I knew, I said everything and lifted my phone and let him hear her voice saying he was planning to do it tonight and needed her to help stage it. And I watched the color drain and return in furious waves as he said I had ruined everything when all I had done was live long enough to read the footnotes. I bluffed hard about the children on their way, and the lawyer with a copy, and the police already briefed, and I saw him run contingencies behind his eyes until at last he sagged and drank and said something that chilled me more than the rain, that Laura wasn't finished with him or with me because she didn't leave loose ends, and now we were both ends flapping in the wind. The window exploded like a gunshot and the kitchen filled with glass that rained across the tile. And then there were footsteps on the porch and the slow turn of the back handle, and the woman who had turned death into a consulting practice stepped inside with her gloved hands and empty patience and told us to stand, and we did because survival sometimes begins with obedience. She lectured us the way a careful teacher explains a lab procedure, that she had our texts and our fear, and the lemon knife for drama, and a tidy narrative about a distraught husband who killed his wife and then himself. And I understood that she was savoring it, that her arrogance was a door left carelessly unlocked. I told her she had miscalculated, not because bravado saves lives, but because truth spoken cleanly can jam a predator's timing. And I lifted my phone so she could see that I'd been on an open call with Marion for 20 minutes and that every word in our ruined kitchen had gone to the one woman in Portland least likely to misfile a recording. Marion's thin voice came out into the room and said she was calling the police, and the fury that rose in Laura's face was the clearest thing I'd seen in 2 days. When she lunged for the phone, I moved first with the kind of speed you develop shelving heavy books on high ladders, flinging the coffee into her eyes and knocking the knife wide with the heel of my hand, and I ordered Robert to the front door because for the first time in my marriage, he could follow or die. We ran into the cold like teenagers, stumbled into the car, and I drove because his hands shook and because I had always driven in emergencies, even when no one noticed, called Marion back and learned the patrol cars were already on the way to our street and that she was bringing everything to the station. The Portland Police Building rose like a lighthouse, and we hurried inside with our glass-dusted clothes and our ragged breaths, and I said the words that sounded like someone else's life, that there had been an attempted murder and a conspiracy and fraud, and that we had evidence. And they led us into a bright room with a recorder and a detective whose pen seemed to sharpen as she listened. Marion arrived with our binder and the audio, And as Detective Morgan paged through transfers and texts and timelines, Robert hunched and tried on the costume of a man who had been led astray, admitting the affair, the sale, the lies, and shifting the killing from his hands to Laura's as if guilt were a coat you could pass across a table. And I let him, not because I believed him innocent, but because the record would be the record, and I needed him scared enough to cooperate while the net closed. The detective said the words I needed to hear, that Maine allows one-party consent, and the recording was admissible, and an alert for Laura had already gone out, and a car would be at my home. And she asked me if I understood how long this would take, and I said I was not going anywhere because I had been still for too many years already. In that small room, I felt the shape of my life straighten, the soft-spoken librarian who knew how to build airtight cases, and the wife who knew her husband's tells, and the grandmother who would not let her children inherit a story full of smoke and rumors. I realized that survival had stopped being a choice and become a craft. Somewhere in the night, Laura Hardy was recalculating. Somewhere in the city, my children were driving north, rehearsing the versions of their parents they thought they knew. And somewhere inside me, a steadier woman stepped forward and took the pen. I understood then that dawn would bring more than light. It would bring subpoenas and statements and bodyguards at the door, and a search for a woman who thought she swam invisible. And I promised myself I would not waste another breath on disbelief or pity, that I would see this through to the kind of ending older women rarely get in stories like mine. An ending where the truth is documented, and the predators are named, and the house on Munjoy Hill is finally quiet for reasons that honor the living. And as the detective asked me to start at the beginning one more time, I did what I have always done best. I put the pieces in order, I made the record whole, and I set the clock not to January 12th, but to the hour Laura Hardy would run out of exits. We repeated our statements until the sky went pale, Robert clinging to a story of manipulation and remorse, while I kept to the narrow lane of dates, documents, and verifiable facts. And at 5 a.m, my children, Michael, Michelle, and Jennifer, arrived white-faced from the highway, gathered me into their arms, and listened as I laid out the whole mechanism that had been built to erase me, the scheduled funeral texts, the transfers to a woman with a pattern, the forged charts with the wrong suite number and the wrong date. And I watched their eyes move from me to their father, as the proof did what love could not. And when they asked him if it was true, the excuses fell away, and the room settled into a silence that sounded like finality. By sunrise, the detective told us they had Laura in custody at the airport, already angling for a deal by painting herself as a consultant who drifted into a mess she did not create. And I understood that the long work had only begun. Months of interviews, subpoenas, forensic accounting, and a legal vocabulary I wish I had never learned. But the center held. Marion's recording was clean and admissible. Kevin's testimony fixed the timeline. The texts and transfers built intent. And for once, arrogance worked for the truth and not against it. We were released at 7, and I chose daylight for my return to the house I had kept for 41 years, accepted the young officer's quiet praise for the coffee and the courage, and told him the only fact that mattered now, that whatever Robert had been to me in the eyes of the world, he no longer was. What followed moved with the steady rhythm of consequence rather than drama. The tape on the broken window, the bench by the bay where I told Robert's attorney that remorse would not buy him grace. The weeks of cataloging and court dates that turned my life from shock to record. And then the outcomes. 25 years for Laura after the pattern finally revealed itself in money trails and witness statements from the old cases. 12 years for Robert on a plea and cooperation that could not scrub the choice he made to plan my death, rather than say the word divorce, and a divorce decree that left me with the house, the retirement, and the share of his practice that was already mine by right. I did not celebrate any of it. I treated it the only way that felt honest, like shelves set back in order after a storm. Then came the work of living, which turned out to be both smaller and braver than I expected. I sold the haunted Victorian to a young family who would love the maple in the yard, found a place of my own above the old port where the harbor light reaches the kitchen in the late afternoon, unpacked only what I wanted to keep and gave away the rest, let Marion talk me into helping with a digital literacy class for seniors, joined a book club that argues like it means it, tried yoga teacher training because I finally could, and practiced saying yes to quiet companionship and no to anything that felt like a bargain against myself. My children came, as they always have, with groceries and wine and stories that ached and sparkled at the same time. And one night we sat at the old table for a last dinner in the empty house, and I apologized for not seeing sooner what I did not want to see. And they told me a truth I needed to hear, that trusting your husband is not a flaw, that survival is not shame, and that I was their hero, even if I did not feel like one. In time, a letter came from the prison, and I read it without answering, because recognition is not redemption, and apology is not repair, and the victory I chose was quieter than any headline. The knowledge that my life was full without him, that my home reflected only my choices, that my breath no longer hitched at the sound of a key in a lock. A year after the night everything changed. I stood on my balcony above Casco Bay while the water burned gold and copper, and I understood the lesson that matters at 66, that survival is not merely breathing, but refusing to surrender your worth, your name, or your future to anyone else's story, and that being underestimated is a blade you can turn in your own hand if you have the patience, the evidence, and the will to move 3 steps ahead. So tell me, what would you have done in my place, with the clock ticking and the tide turning, with love soured into threat and 2 predators circling the same prize? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you found strength in this story, stay with me for the next chapter. Tap the video on your screen now, because the twist that saved me then may just be the one that saves someone you love.